Good afternoon to all of you. You're after lunch. I know that means that you'd like to take a nap. I think that the discussions here will keep you awake. I certainly hope that they will. You might ask, why is the director of a library leading a discussion, moderating a discussion about education? Well, the short answer to that is I'm here at Yad Vashem 31 years, and my first 6 years were in education.
Exactly.
When we were a very small education department. And if I say about myself, you can take New Jersey, you can take the boy out of New Jersey, but you can't take New Jersey out of the boy.
Wow.
The same is true about the education. You can take the boy out of the education department, but you can't take education out of the boy. And in the many things I do at Yad Vashem, I feel that I'm always informed by the fact that I began in education. It's very much in my mind, even when working with all kinds of people. And I'd like to tell you two quick anecdotes before we begin the session. One of them has to do with a visit that we had one morning where I'd come to work in, I think, jeans and a t-shirt or whatever, and I got called in and said, go home, put on a suit. Abner Shalem, unfortunately, is not feeling well. You have to take her around the president of China. So I ran home, put on my suit, came back, and began taking around President Jiang Zemin. This was quite a few years ago. So we had a very interesting visit, and for me, one of the most interesting parts was at the end where you signed the book. You're a visitor at Yad Vashem. He took out what looked like a ballpoint pen, but it had a brush on the end, and he wrote his characters, and that way signed the book. End of visit. 3 or 4 years later, Yisrael Singer was speaking here at Yad Vashem, and he told the following story. He said that a delegation from China had approached him and the people he was working with because they wanted to learn more about how the preservation of memory, of historical memory, works. And he said that Jiang Zemin was very impressed by his tour at Yad Vashem. So I was sitting in the audience thinking, oh, I'm the only one that knows it. I took it around that day. But it means that a seed that I planted and Yad Vashem planted somehow bore fruit at a later date. And that's part of what education is all about, that you're doing things and you don't know when they're going to bear fruit. The other thing is this. This is the other side of that. This is called the anti-ante. Some of you far away, you can't see it very well. This was produced in Germany before Hitler came into power by what's called the Central Verein, the main Jewish organization. And what it is, well, I'll tell you how I first heard about it. I had the great privilege of studying with Professor George Mosser in 1980. It's a long time ago now. And George was sitting in class and he said, you know, I used to have this thing. Say I was riding on the train and somebody said that the Jews are out to take over the world, or out to take over the government of Germany. Well, I would take out this flashcard and read the answer. When I became the head of the library 20 years ago, I was downstairs, down in the stacks looking around, and I saw this thing, the anti-ante. This is what George was talking about. It's flashcards that give you answers to questions. It's giving you truth versus lies. If you take card number 59, that's the one George was talking about. And it'll tell you that in so many members of the Reichstag, the German parliament, as of the year this was produced, only 12 were Jews, to show that they're not trying to take over the government. So the anti-ante was produced as an educational tool in the widest sense of education. Did it stop events from unfolding in Germany? Of course not. Did it save the Jews of Germany? No.
But turn on the microphone, we don't hear you.
Excuse me?
Turn on the microphone, we don't hear you.
You don't hear me. The microphone's on. Okay. There was an attempt, though, by the Jews of Germany to deal on what you call an educational level with the threat that was just beginning of Hitler. And that, I think, teaches a lot about humility. Education's our main tool in so many things that we talk about. We know we're limited in what I can achieve, but we know that it's our tool and we have to use it because we really don't have a better tool. That's the tool. So I think about those two things, about planting the seed, you don't know where it's going to go, and the attempts that you make, you don't know, they might not help in the end. You still have to keep doing them. And so, to me, that's one of the reasons why I feel maybe if I'm asked me to be here this morning or this afternoon. Now, the format we have is rather simple. We wrote a number of questions that we sent to these lovely men here on our panel who are going to deal with the questions. And they each chose two that they would like to address in depth. What we'll also do is after they've addressed the ones in depth that they're interested in, open up for other things to be said, because I'm sure there will be a sort of cross-pollination going on here, and that will be the heart of the discussion. And we'll see how things go. I can't promise you, but maybe we'll be able to take questions from you as well as time goes on. We have to play it by ear a little bit. And I think all of you got booklets that have information about all of the men on the panel, and that was one of the good ideas here at Yad Vashem, so we don't have to spend a lot of time introducing everybody. So I'll just let you know who they are offhand. We have Rabbi Nochum Kaplan, who is from the Central Education Office of Chabad in the Gola. We have Dr. Marc Kramer, who's the Executive Director of RAVSAK, which is a nice English-Hebrew acronym for Reshet B'tei Sefer Kilatiyim. We have Professor Leonard Saxe from Brandeis University, from the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies. We have Rabbi Kenneth who's the Dean of Yeshiva University for the Center for the Jewish Future. And then we have Rabbi Shlomo Riskin, Chancellor of Torah Institutions Israel, and a number of other hats that he wears quite frequently in this country. So I would like to open with the first question, not necessarily in the order that I gave them to you. But this is the one that I think most people on the panel were interested in answering, so we'll start with that. And the question is, to what extent is the Holocaust part of our Jewish identity? And what role does it play? And I'd like to turn to you, Marc, if you'd like to begin. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Is that on?
Yeah, please, they're on.
Good? Okay, great, thanks. So I'm going to speak from the perspective of the community day school in North America, which briefly are independent Jewish schools that are not aligned with the denominational movement of Judaism, but rather instead strive to serve Jewish children from across the spectrum. And what that means on the ground is that these schools are often serving children and families for whom the Jewish day school is one of their only institutions of Jewish connectedness and identification. Our schools have many children who are from intermarried families. In one of my schools, they estimate that 75% of the children live in households where only one parent is a Jew by birth. Many of the schools don't look like that, but it speaks to a broad range. The schools increasingly see themselves on the front line of Jewish identity and really questioning assimilation as it's impacting the Jewish community. It's particularly in the United States, but in Canada and Latin America as well. In our schools, Jewish identity of itself is really a very complicated question, especially given that many of the children are not going home in home environments where Jewish identity is the core identity at all. We have a lot of very young families in our schools, families that are choosing day school as their Jewish institution of identity, often in opposition to joining a synagogue. And as such, the role of Shoah in forming identity is very complicated. These are families that choose day school. It's not like for those of us who live in the Orthodox world where it's not day school, no day school, it's which yeshiva are our kids going to go to. These are families who are choosing between private school, public school, prep school, but Jewish school is one of the many choices. And as such, these are schools that are driven by market forces, and we're not hearing broadly from families a great desire to have a great deal of Holocaust education. There's a sense that it plays into a lachrymose theory of Jewish living that they don't experience themselves. Many of them who live in mixed marriage families find this topic very, very complicated, where kids go home and say, well, I know what happened to Abba's family, but Ima or Mommy, was your family involved in this? And the kids really, they see sort of an us-them paradigm that they don't know what to do with. That being said, we have about 130 schools, and Shoah education does have a role in all of them. It varies greatly from schools that touch on it very gently, usually around Yom HaShoah, to those that have courses that are offered as an option to those that have core courses, often connected to the work of facing history and ourselves, which is something that's taken, I think, pretty deep root in our schools. So from our perspective, we want this to be part of what the children learn, and obviously a part of the Jewish narrative that becomes their own, but ultimately it's one in which we face some internal resistance.
Thank you. Rabbi Riskin, may I turn to you also with this question?
I want to give a rather negative answer. I have many, many questions about the Holocaust as being something that forms Jewish identity. I believe that is against the most fundamental teaching in Judaism. And therefore, I have many mixed feelings. I understand why it is that people who have loved ones who perished in the Holocaust wanted so very much to have Holocaust memorials. But I believe that the Holocaust memorial as the center for Jewish identity and the Holocaust subject matter, which is the center for university teachings about Judaism, which it is in some places, I think is very counterproductive and negative. Because it makes Judaism a religion of victims. And nobody wants to be a victim, and certainly nobody wants to continue to be a victim. And if there's one strong message about God, and it's interesting to me that God and theology had no place in any of these questions, and I think that something's wrong, therefore, I would venture to say with the questions. Because that is the big, forgive my analogy, which is totally imperfect, but that's the elephant in the room whenever anyone discusses Holocaust. Our God is a redeemer. That's what we say in the Amidah 3 times a day. Goel Yisrael. And that's very antithetical to the Holocaust when it is seen not in direct consequence with Israel. And that's the tremendous advantage of Yad Vashem, where Yad Vashem is critically important. Now, from this perspective, I want to say only one word. That the most important part of the Holocaust, from my point of view, is that we survived it. And not only did we survive it, but we went on to create the State of Israel. And that's the important message. You know, it's very interesting. We have the night of our freedom, our celebration of our freedom. Zaman Chirutenu is the Pesach Seder. The Jews experienced the Holocaust-like experience in Egypt for 210 years. When we were enslaved and our babies were murdered. We remember that, but as part of the context of our redemption from Egypt and ultimately having reached Israel. I believe that in this sense, the Holocaust has to be part of our identity, but it must be Holocaust-Israel. And what has to be always stressed is that although it would seem to be that the Jewish people should have disappeared after the Holocaust, every reason for that to have happened, the very antithesis occurred. Hitler didn't succeed. We won over Hitler. And we became a much stronger nation afterwards.
Thank you very much. Rabbi Kaplan, would you like to also address this question? It's fine.
I'd like to address a variation of the question. Not just perhaps to change one word, and that is, to what degree should and can the Holocaust be part of Jewish identity? Let me personalize it a little bit. My first memories are of a DP camp. I grew up with children who didn't know what the word grandfather meant. Many of the children in my class had their parents' families destroyed, brothers, sisters, fathers' wives. And to me, this was a narrative growing up. So whether or not the Holocaust was seared into my identity, I think, is not a question. As far as my children are concerned, they grew up in a home where their grandparents talked a little sometimes. And they had neighbors and friends who survived the Holocaust. So to them, the Holocaust was real as well. In fact, Monday night, my son, who is a rabbi in Toronto, made his annual shul dinner's theme Nitzalei HaShoah, and 600 people came to honor the half a dozen surviving members within the shul who are Nitzalei HaShoah. My grandchildren are growing up in homes where the Shoah is still a sacred word. In the 1970s, I was a principal in a day school in Norfolk, Virginia. And as a hobby, I taught high school kids whom I could grab off the street sometimes, and some of our graduates. And I taught them units, a unit on this and a unit on that. Some of those children, and there were perhaps 60, 70 altogether in the course of the years, are today the core and the bedrock of the Norfolk, Virginia community, which is a different community from the community I lived in. Some of those children have children, and their children are the ones who are on campuses across the country using the word Nazism and Zionism in one sentence, and a mechalel v'shem of Shoah, whatever that word means, and I want to talk about that for a moment. My concern is not about my children. I don't even think my concern is about my grandchildren. My concern is for the hundreds of thousands of Jewish children who either attend or don't attend day schools, but for whom the idea of Holocaust is frightening, is terrifying, it's depressing. They ponder and have no answers. Some of them have their faith, such as it is, shaken. And I think we need to see that the Holocaust, not so much the tragedy, but the lessons of the Holocaust are seared into the Jewish consciousness. Rabbi Riskin mentioned the Pesach Seder. One of the pivotal things that we say in the Pesach Seder is V'hi she'amda l'avoteinu v'hi she'amda l'avoseinu. And he said the great deal of joy. Shebechol dor v'dor omdim oleinu lechalotenu. Every single generation we are faced with peril. V'akadosh baruch hu matzilenu miyadam. We don't say that with a sense of terror. We sing it. We talk about the triumph. We talk about overcoming. The lessons of the Holocaust can be frightening to children because they are depressing. The lessons of the Holocaust that we must teach them must be lessons of emunah and faith, of points of light that shine out from the darkness. I could lecture on this for an hour, but just nikudot. Last week, somebody told me of a story of a distant relative. His name was Meir Bukit. Talmid Yeshiva in Otvotsk. And when, on the 1st of September, the bombs began to fall, a yeshiva of more than 300 boys ran home. Sometime in Cheshvan, 2.5 months later, this 21-year-old decided, what are these boys doing at home? I'll gather them in my town of Radom, and there we'll try to create some sort of yeshiva, something. And he had over 180 Bachrim came to the town of Radom, and he fed them, and he found some way to bring Rosh Yeshiva. And when somebody asked him, what are you doing? They'll be here soon. He said, but until they come. Where does that strength of character come from? Should we not dwell on that? Or when my wife's aunt tells of listening to the song of Lechadodi coming from another barrack in Auschwitz, and they found the young woman who was singing, a young woman, mind you, and brought her into their barracks. She was an emaciated skeleton at best. And when she was asked, why do you sing Lechadodi? she said, because even here our hearts have to sing. There are points of light that shine from Auschwitz and from the DP camps that I was in, from Poking, and from all over Germany later on. And that the people who left with nothing more than rags on their back built lives and children and families and built Israel. Should not those things be the lessons of the Holocaust? So I submit to you that if we continue to teach our children merely horrors, if we teach them facts and figures and names, dates, and places, we will depress them and alienate them. If we teach them points of light, if we teach them the inspiration of those who either perished or survived, if we teach them that they too be inspired by the faith and the acts of heroism, how we transcended, and as Rabbi Riskin said, we won, then that inspiration can be and will be seared into our consciousness and become part of our identity.
Thank you very much. Professor Saxe, please.
First, I must say that it is an honor to be with you and to be part of this panel of distinguished rabbis. I think one of the things I've learned is that that narrative, that story, is critical to talking about the Shoah. And I was thinking as I heard the other comments that in 1932, 1933, the eve of Hitler's taking over in Germany, Albert Einstein wrote a book, a set of essays, translated into English as The World as I Know It. And it was dedicated to the contributions of Jews to society, to culture, to the world. And as part of this essay, the series of essays, he wrote about Jewish identity. Now, Einstein, of course, was a Jew, but he was a Jew who had received very little Jewish education. And at one point he writes and makes an analogy between a snail, the little animal with a shell, and Jewish identity. And he talks about the fact that we recognize a snail because genderize it, his shell, but even without the shell, what is on the outside, if it loses its shell, then it is still a snail. And he says that even he, as a Jew who doesn't have the outward trappings of being a Jew, that he is a Jew because inside he shares the values and the history. He doesn't use the word, but he means the memory of being part of a people. And I share Rabbi Riskin's view that the Shoah and that the Holocaust cannot be the center of Jewish identity, particularly for diaspora Jews, that what Jewish identity is something that is inside a person, that it is a memory, it is a set of values, it is a set of principles. What is so difficult about the Shoah is that it is, as part of Jewish identity, how Jews were defined from the outside, not from the inside. And part of the challenge of Jewish education and the challenge of Jewish education in the diaspora is how do we retain the memory of the Shoah without it being the definition of who is a Jew and how we are a Jew, and how the reaction of other people to Jews and the treatment of the disgusting, horrific treatment of Jews during the Shoah, how we can not let that define who we are. That's the challenge.
Thank you very much. Before we go on to the next question, I want to know if anybody would like to make an additional short comment based on what we're set up to now. Yeah, please.
One of the works that we have in the Bible that focuses on dealing with challenges, theodicy, is the book of Eicha. And while many of the books in the Bible are challenged throughout the Talmud, whether they should be canonized or not, books like Shir HaShirim, the Song of Songs, the book of Job, the book of Eicha, which is a challenging book, was never questioned. And one of the reasons is because throughout our generations, it's always important to ask the theological questions about the role of God in Jewish history and for us to communicate that role. But to also realize something else. And Rabbi Soloveitchik used to teach us that every single word, every single Hebrew word, that if you really want to understand what it means, look at the first time it is used in the Bible. So the word Eicha, the first time that word Eicha is used is as Ayeka. When Adam and Chava are asked by God, Adam and Eve are asked by God, where are you? And I think that there's a message there, and that is, I don't have to add to the wonderful words that were said by the panelists, but one of the messages I like to communicate to my rabbinical students and to rabbis throughout America is, I think one of the questions we have to ask ourselves when we deal with the Shoah is the question of Ayeka. Where were people? And the responsibility for us to realize that apathy is also a message that we need to communicate regarding our responsibilities to other Jews, as well as our responsibility to society. And sometimes we have to ask ourselves and recognize that the difference between the word Geula, redemption, that we see all around us, and Gola, diaspora, is just one letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and that is the Aleph, Ani. What role am I playing within that? And I often think that that is another point of light that needs to be communicated in a proactive way, reflecting but with a vision towards the future of how we inspire our students, whether they're in community day schools, whether they're theological students, whether they are, as I am, a child of a survivor, that we don't only ask ourselves about the darkness, but realize that we can create future points of light by using the Shoah as a model in some ways for the question, both in the negative and the positive, about Ayeka, and to recognize that sometimes we make the difference between a diaspora existence and a redemptive existence.
I would like to pick up on what was just said by Rabbi Branda and just question something that Rabbi Saxe mentioned. Professor Saxe mentioned. It's good, you're kind of like this, you come out
Listen, I dress like a professor.
and you have a beard, and so you qualify very well. I don't think that Jewish identity is internal. I think the Jewish identity has got to be external. If it's going to be meaningful, it's got to be expressed in action. In what we do and in how we live. It's not enough to feel internally one's Judaism. Because we're not disembodied spirits or intellects. We're people with hands and legs and mouths. And Jewish identity has to be spoken, and Jewish identity has to be acted upon. Part of this is bound up with the Holocaust and Israel. And it's bound up with theology, and it's bound up with how we Jews see ourselves and how I think we've got to see ourselves. There's an amazing passage in the Talmud, in Brachot Daf Gimel, where Rabbi Yossi, after the Holocaust of the destruction of the Second Temple, went into one of the ruins in Jerusalem to pray. And Elijah the prophet, who's the one who's going to bring redemption to the Jewish people, wants to speak to him, but he doesn't go into the ruins, he waits outside. And he asked Rabbi Yossi, why did you go into the ruins? And Rabbi Yossi said, I went into the ruins to pray. And he said, you should have prayed by then on the road. The end of Parshat Mishpatim, on the road, Derech, means the road to Israel, the road to rebuild. Don't wallow in sorrow and in tears. We are expected to be God's full partners, and maybe even senior partners, and to act and to move. And we have to act and move, number one, in terms of reacting whenever Jews are endangered anywhere in the world, which is absolutely the case. We have to understand that power may corrupt, and absolute power may corrupt absolutely, but we also saw in the Holocaust that powerlessness can sometimes corrupt more than anything else. And we have to therefore be proactive. And we have to really be God's partners in our own redemption. And that, I think, is the most valuable message that can emerge from the Holocaust.
So just very briefly, yes, of course, there has to be an expression of Jewishness externally, but I'm a psychologist by training. Life course development doesn't proceed in a straight line. Life is a bunch of up and down moments. And to use another important Jewish figure, secular figure of the 20th century, Louis Brandeis, the first Jewish Supreme Court Justice in the United States, but also the leader of the American Zionist movement. I wouldn't be here today. I teach at Brandeis University. I'm not sure where we would be collectively had not Brandeis taken the mantle of leadership that he did in the early part of the 20th century. Now, who was this guy, Louis Brandeis? Louis Brandeis came from a family who had come from Czechoslovakia to the middle of the United States, born in the middle of the 19th century. He had no Jewish education. He had no formal expression of his Judaism. His mother was thought to be part of the Frankist school that rejected Judaism. And it wasn't until he was in his mid-50s, that he began to explore his Jewishness. And it's very interesting. In 1909, a play opened, a Yiddish play in New York, Pentel Yid, the Jewish Spark. And it was just about that time that meeting with the secretary, the former secretary of Herzl, who was then the editor of the Jewish newspaper in Boston, he started to learn and talk about Israel, about Palestine, and about the formation of a Jewish home. And it was through his involvement in this, and intellectually what happened with Brandeis is that he discovered that the story of the Jews was actually the story of America, and that the story of freedom in America was based on the paradigm of the story of the freedom of Jews. And so late in life, he becomes affiliated, identified, and begins to express himself as a Jew. And over the next 30 years, he becomes the leader of the American Zionist movement, and becomes this absolutely critical figure. Up to that point, there was no evidence of his Jewishness. So I'm not willing to give up on any Jewish soul, and I think that what we need to make sure is there has to be something inside before there can be something outside, and we have to help people develop the inside, and we have to not allow other people on the outside to define who we are and how we ultimately behave.
Thank you very much. Before we go to the next question,
Before we go to the next question, just a remark referring to what Rabbi Riskin said. Yes, we have to see the outcomes of the Holocaust, but don't forget that the Yahadut teaches us Lachor also. Third of Ha'am HaYehudi, 70 years ago, was killed. A whole world doesn't exist anymore that was there. The first thing before the overcome of the Holocaust is to really express to our students that world that doesn't exist anymore. They have to know about it. They have to, I don't want to say mourn about it in terms of, but the Ha'am HaYehudi that knows to generation to remember the Churban and to remember 70 years later, I think before we go to the, and I agree with you 100%, it has to be led with action, not victimized. But the world before the Holocaust was a dynamic world that we can take so much out of it. The everyday life in the Holocaust, people trying to keep who they were from before the Holocaust can give our students such a perspective of what Jewishness actually means, not only as a victim, as people that are trying to cope with dehumanization and להרוס את צלם האדם שנברא, את האדם שנברא בצלם אלוקים. That's what the Nazis were trying to do. So exposing to our students, first of all, before we go to the outcome